right, Christy, thank you. Bill Bratton probably knows more about policing than just about anybody else in the country. He was chief of police here in L.A. He also led departments in Boston and New York, and he's out with a new book. It is called The Profession, a memoir of community, race, and the arc of policing in America. He joins us live along with Phil Shuman, who, of course, has been covering these issues for decades, including Chief Bratton's time here in Los Angeles. Chief Bratton, welcome to the show. Honored to have you.
Good to be with you.
All right, you hear those stats. They're scary. What is the most important thing that can be done to reduce crime in Southern California?
Most important thing is the idea to understand that we've been here before and that we have been able to deal with this before. Even with the surge in violence in your city, my city, New York, the country, large cities, medium-sized cities, the scale of the violence in most places still does not approach what we experienced in the early 90s, or in fact, as recently as 2001, 2002 in LA when I first came there. So that's the good news. The bad news is the acceleration of this trend is likely to increase during the summer months when violent crime, particularly shootings, tend to increase. So in terms of addressing this current problem, it is the idea of looking at what worked in the past, matching that up against the current situation, what tools are still available, what tools are no longer available, and then trying to come up with new initiatives. The compounding factor at this juncture in your city, my city, the country, is that we have a number of initiatives, if you will, that have been underway for a couple of years. Criminal justice reform, bail reform, defund the police, which has dramatically impacted you in Los Angeles as much as any place in America. And this is a department that has been underfunded and understaffed throughout its history. So that there's all types of compounding factors involved. But what it's going to take is not just the police solving this issue, not just the politicians, but listening to that young woman, understanding it's a shared responsibility. If the community doesn't cooperate in terms of providing witness testimony, information to the police, that shared responsibility, it's just not going to work.
Well, you brought up the defund the police movement, and that makes me, of course, think of the death of George Floyd, and that's when the call for that really became paramount. The divide has grown seemingly between police and community. If you're chief now, how do you bridge that divide?
With great difficulty. The number one imperative is to try to find ways to, as you're pointing out, restore the trust. The trust had grown in Los Angeles. I had that experience of watching that trust grow from 2002 to 2009. I think it continued under my successor, Charlie Beck, and was continuing under Mike Moore until the horrific events around the death of George Floyd, in which it all seemed to collapse. And I think it took us all by surprise that we had not ever experienced the sudden collapse of relationships between police and community to that degree, although LA had certainly a history with the riots that you experienced, some of the worst in the country's history. But even coming out of those riots, there was an opportunity, and I experienced in LA, to begin to restore that trust. It's going to be more difficult this time than it was then, but it can still be done. And it's going to have to be done, however, with this idea of trying to find common ground. And I write about this in the new book, The Profession, this idea of everybody has to basically get onto that common ground. Nobody is going to be totally satisfied with the results. But it's going to be more difficult this time than it was in 2002 when I was there, or 1994 when I was in New York City, or 1990 when I was in Boston. Because there's so much that's changed in the 21st century. The new forms of crime. Back in the good old days, which were the bad old days of the early 90s, it was crime and disorder. We always have crime and disorder magnified again in the 21st century, but it's now compounded by social media. It's compounded by all the cyber issues we're recently reading about. And it's compounded by this political world that we're in the United States, the right and the left, and all issues. We don't seem to be able to find a way to talk with each other, to see each other, and I talk about that. Sweet Alice Harris down in South LA, the expression she used in dealing with me, that you see us, you really see us. Chief Moore, the mayor, everybody's gonna have to try to find a way to see each other in a different way than we have in the past, or you have in the past.
Yeah, and Sweet Alice still an activist all these years later. Phil Shuman, now time for a reunion between you and the chief.
Actually,
Two
we were there
Bostonians,
with,
Chief.
about a year ago. I'm sorry?
Thanks, Chief. It's interesting to me that you that one of the parts of the title of your book is the art of policing. What is it about the job or the art of policing that law enforcement critics just do not understand?
They fail to understand that we have been reforming. We are always reforming. We're like medicine. I use a lot of medical comparisons in the book, because people really get medicine more than they understand the police. This idea that the practice of medicine, that sometimes they harm you in trying to cure you. Radiation, chemo to deal with a cancer, surgery even. Similarly, the police sometimes, unfortunately, have to harm individuals, taking them into custody, etc., when they're fighting and resisting. It never looks good. Doesn't feel good to a patient being treated by a doctor. Doesn't feel good by somebody who's interacting with police in a forceful situation. But the idea of trying to find this common ground, it's difficult, but it can be done. And in your city, which was probably one of the most racially divided cities in America, where its police force had literally been at war, and I use this term comfortably using it, had been at war with this black community for 50 years, we began to turn a corner in 2002, 2009, and continue with my successors. But quite obviously, the wounds had never totally healed because they were ripped open so easily with the death of George Floyd. And going forward, it's going to be more difficult, I think, than at any time in the past. Good news is, however, is that there is a growing consensus that this is a national problem. As we're coming out of the coronavirus, this problem had been growing over the last 2 years, but was not really being recognized in the media, by the politicians. Everybody was focused on dealing with COVID. Now that COVID is fortunately coming under control, the national attention is focusing on this issue once again. Right. And when you get that type of attention, hopefully you start getting some resolution and some ideas.
Phil, go ahead.
Chief, if you had to design the ideal law enforcement officer for 21st century policing, what would that be? What would that look like?
One, that you would want somebody coming into the profession that comes in with, I would argue, that what we hire in New York City is somebody with at least 2 years of college or military background. Secondly, that they pass extensive psychological tests. In California, we have the ability to also give lie detector tests that we are not able to do on the East Coast. Secondly, that you would train them a lot better to be more of an ideal officer. LA has probably one of the best training programs in America. I replicated it when I went back to New York in 2014. Your senior lead officer program, the academy training where the recruit comes out of the academy, and for the first year has to always be with a specially trained field training officer. I would argue the average recruit in America should get at least 1 year of academy training before coming out of the academy. The complexities of policing in the 21st century, you cannot teach all of that to a young man, young woman in 6 months. I'm sorry, when I came in 2002, I had to go through almost a full academy routine in my first year as police chief. So I understand how grueling those 20 some odd subjects can be trying to master. So the ideal police officer, the only way to get somebody that's going to be able to work better in the community than the existing workforce is somebody that is trained much better, trained much more broadly and comprehensively, and then continually trained. Look at all the training we want to give them now: implicit bias training, de-escalation training, drug recognition training. And then this idea of defund the police is also about the idea of, can we take responsibilities that have been dumped on the police over the last 50 years and actually give them to somebody else, whether it's the homeless issue, the emotionally disturbed issue, the drug addiction issue. All those issues end up in the safety net that police have always provided.
Right.
The society for the last 50 years, that arc of 50 years, has failed. We created the homeless problem in the 70s when we emptied out the mental institutions. We failed at dealing with the drug addiction problem and increasingly with the opioid problem. And we have never really found a way to basically deal with the race issue successfully.
Well, we want to talk more about the homeless issue, which is such a big issue here. So we're going to continue our conversation with Chief Bratton after this. We will talk about homelessness and potential solutions from what he has learned there.
Stay with us. We'll have more right after the break. All right, let's welcome back. We are with Chief Bratton, former LAPD chief, of course, Bill Bratton. There he is, and continuing our conversation with Phil Shuman as well. So let's talk about the #1 issue that's plaguing neighborhoods throughout the city of Los Angeles right now, and that is homelessness. Chief Bratton, if you were chief of police right now in Los Angeles, what is the #1 thing that you would do to start the process of fixing this?
I would basically start by literally saying that the problem as it's currently situated in Los Angeles is hopeless. There is no resolution for it. Why? Because the law works against you, all the various court decisions, federal court decisions, the ACLU cases that have been filed against the Los Angeles Police Department, the city of Los Angeles. Los Angeles, California have never sufficiently resourced trying to deal with its homeless problem. So now it has exploded to an extent that you don't have an ability to control it. You don't have the laws, you don't have the resources, and there are no solutions at hand. It is going to take an incredible amount of research and effort to try to resolve your issue. You have the worst homeless problem in America by any scale. Skid Row, it was awful when I was there. It's even worse 20 years later. I wish I could offer you more in the sense of optimism about that situation, but I can't. That when I was out there, I was frustrated at every turn as we tried to do something about it. The police are not the resolution of this. And I don't know if you have sufficient revenue, although actually I understand you got billions of dollars.
Got a lot of revenue. Yeah, the governor is proposing $12 billion for homelessness. Phil,
well, let's hope they're able to do something with it. But you know what you won't do? They won't build the housing, which is part of the resolution of it. But among that homeless population of people who won't go into housing if you build it, because so many of them are emotionally disturbed, so many are drug addicted. They are a service-resistant population, and trying to do anything with them is impeded by the courts and people who are well-intended, ACL and other ones. But I wish I had more of a resolution for it. That there is some resolution for families, et cetera. But for what you see down in Skid Row, I don't know. I'm not a miracle worker, and I've not met anybody yet that has the magic wand that can solve your problem.
Phil?
Well, also what seems to be frustrating from a law enforcement point of view, and this goes into this discussion, the larger discussion we've had with Connie Rice, your friend, about that, the so-called warrior versus guardian officer, is that every police officer I've talked to, they want no part of the homeless problem. That's not their issue. Do you agree?
It shouldn't be their issue, but because the other social nets that were supposed to be in place over the years to help that population have just disintegrated because there's never been enough money. The times they tried to build housing, it was thwarted every time they tried to build housing for the homeless. And the concentration downtown of the various missions, that was a deliberate political action to keep it isolated into that part of the city until that part of the city, as real estate became very valuable. Then all of a sudden you woke up to the fact that Skid Row had a homeless problem. So in some respects, this problem was created by the politicians consciously over 50 to 60 years. And now you're basically having to deal with a problem that has become so complex, like Gideon's knot, there's no ability to unravel it. Again, I wish I had the answer. We resolved some of it, but we are thwarted at every turn by the courts out there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the hope. I'm feeling really good.
Hope springs eternal, but I'll tell you, at the moment, it's going to take a lot of trying to find common ground to deal with this issue, and wrestling with the same issue in New York. Same issue.
We appreciate your honest critique.
Yeah,
for sure.
and you can learn a lot about community policing and really interesting stories in the book. Again, let's put it up on the screen. It is called The Profession. Bill Bratton, one of the most experienced law enforcement officials in the history of our country. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Chief.
Okay, sorry for telling you like it is.
No, we're glad you did.
We appreciate it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.